Vermont, 2003. A small town wrapped in mist and mountain quiet. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and strangers stand out. It was early October when she vanished. One moment, she was leaving the community library after her evening shift. The next, her sedan was found on a rural stretch just outside Brattleboro, its hazard light still blinking against the darkness. Inside, her purse sat untouched. Her phone and keys were gone. The driver's seat was pushed back slightly, as if someone taller had been behind the wheel. Her name was Rachel Ann Pierce, 26 years old, a substitute teacher and part-time librarian, known for her shy smile and steady kindness. In Vermont's still autumn air, a quiet horror began to grow. Rachel lived alone in a rented cottage near the West River, about 15 minutes from downtown. Friends said she loved the calm of small-town life, coffee at the same diner every morning, long walks by the water, her camera always around her neck. She was saving for grad school, hoping to earn a master's in education. That Wednesday evening, October 8, 2003, she clocked out of work at 8:43 p.m. A co-worker remembered her locking the door and waving good night. She never made it home. When her car was spotted just before midnight by a passing truck driver, its headlights dimmed, engine cold, the discovery didn't immediately sound alarms. Cars sometimes broke down on that narrow stretch of Route 30. But the hazard lights, still blinking rhythmically, felt wrong, like a signal waiting too long for help that never came. The deputy who responded said it was eerie, the purse in place, the seatbelt unbuckled. No sign of a struggle, no footprints visible on the shoulder. The night was cold and dry. The ground should have held some impression. It didn't. It was as if she'd simply disappeared into the trees. By morning, word had spread through town. Rachel's parents, who lived 30 miles away in Springfield, arrived before sunrise. Her father, Thomas, walked the roadside with a flashlight until police stopped him. "I just kept thinking maybe she was hurt somewhere close," he later told reporters. Volunteers gathered within hours, friends, teachers, even her former students. Vermont State Police organized a full-scale search. K-9 units, a helicopter sweep, divers combing the nearby riverbanks. But after 3 days, nothing. No torn fabric, no phone, no shoe prints. The woods were silent. Detectives canvassed Rachel's life inch by inch. She had no known enemies, no history of depression or instability, no disputes with co-workers. Her last cell phone signal pinged briefly near an old service road branching off Route 30, but it was weak and inconsistent, typical for that area in 2003 when towers were sparse. Investigators followed every lead, a reported sighting of a similar car in New Hampshire, a strange man loitering near the library days before, a tip about someone offering rides along back roads. All of them fizzled out. Within weeks, the case went cold. For the community, the uncertainty was unbearable. Brattleboro hadn't seen a case like this in decades. Flyers with Rachel's photo. Light brown hair, grey-green eyes, a soft half-smile, papered shop windows and church boards. Candlelight vigils filled the town green that fall. Flickering lights reflected off wet pavement. Her mother spoke softly at one of them. She was the kind of person who'd stop to help anyone. "That's what scares me most." Maybe she trusted the wrong person. Investigators kept working even as public attention waned. They tested the car for fingerprints, fibers, and biological material, using the technology available in 2003. Partial prints were lifted from the door handle, but none matched known offenders. A faint trace of skin cells on the steering wheel was too degraded for analysis by that era's DNA standards. The science simply wasn't there yet. Still, the evidence was carefully preserved, sealed and stored under strict chain of custody, something that would prove crucial 2 decades later. In early 2004, a hunter discovered something buried under leaves, less than 3 miles from where Rachel's car was found. At first, he thought it was discarded clothing. When officers arrived, they uncovered human remains wrapped in weathered fabric. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Rachel. The condition of her body made it difficult to determine an exact cause of death, but forensic examiners noted damage consistent with blunt trauma. No signs of robbery. Her jewelry was intact, her clothes not torn in a way suggesting sexual assault. It was violent, yes, but personal, random? Investigators couldn't tell. For years, the case haunted the state police. Leads grew thinner. Detectives retired. By 2006, the file had expanded to nearly 2,000 pages. Every so often, new tips came, usually after TV reruns of cold case shows or newspaper anniversary stories. In 2010, an anonymous caller claimed a man had bragged about something bad off Route 30 at a local bar years earlier. The lead went nowhere. The suspect described was vague, maybe mid-30s, beard pickup truck. In rural Vermont, that described half the county. As DNA science evolved, the evidence box from Rachel's case sat quietly in storage, sealed tight. Around 2018, the Vermont State Crime Lab began re-examining older cases that might benefit from new DNA extraction methods. Rachel's file was on that list. Analysts reopened the envelope, containing the swabs from the steering wheel and door handle. This time, with advanced touch DNA recovery techniques, they were able to isolate a profile. It wasn't enough for a full identification yet, but it was more than they'd ever had before. A mixture of Rachel's DNA and an unknown male contributor. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, the National DNA Database, but there were no immediate matches. It could have been anyone, someone with no record or a man who'd never been arrested. The case remained unsolved, but that tiny genetic trace kept hope alive. By 2020, the use of forensic genetic genealogy, matching crime scene DNA with distant relatives in consumer ancestry databases, had begun changing the landscape of cold cases nationwide. Vermont's Attorney General approved limited use of this new technique, but every case had to meet strict legal and privacy requirements. Rachel's case qualified. Investigators partnered with a licensed forensic genealogy lab based in Virginia. They uploaded the digital profile and began building family trees through distant cousin matches. Slowly, branches connected. Second cousins in Maine, a great-uncle in New York, then a shared ancestor leading to one small family line in southern Vermont. The process took over a year. It was painstaking, methodical, and fueled by technology that hadn't existed back in 2003. But in late 2023, the puzzle began to close in on a single name. Mark Ellison, 52 years old, a local contractor, who had once worked maintenance at the very library where Rachel disappeared. Ellison had no prior violent record, just minor misdemeanors, a DUI, and a brief stint out of state for work. He was married at the time, living less than 2 miles from Rachel's cottage. Police interviewed him back in 2003 as part of their standard sweep. He said he'd barely known her, only exchanged small talk about fixing a flickering hallway light. His alibi had been thin. He claimed to be home watching TV. But with no evidence tying him to the scene, detectives had moved on. 2 decades later, his DNA would tell a different story. By early 2024, police quietly began surveillance, collecting discarded items to confirm the match. They retrieved a coffee cup from a trash bin outside a local diner. The DNA matched the sample from Rachel's car, with a probability exceeding 1 in a trillion. The cold case that had defined a generation of investigators was about to break wide open. But before the arrest, they needed airtight corroboration, not just a genetic link, but a narrative that placed him with her that night. Detectives reopened old statements, re-interviewed witnesses, and found something overlooked years ago. A co-worker who remembered seeing Rachel speaking with a man near the back entrance the evening she vanished. A man matching Ellison's build, wearing a brown jacket with a company logo. At the time, she hadn't recognized him and assumed he was just another town worker. That logo matched a defunct maintenance company Ellison had worked for in 2003, the Small detail that once seemed meaningless now bridged the gap between speculation and proof. 21 years after Rachel Ann Pierce vanished from a quiet Vermont road, the truth was finally surfacing, a truth that had waited in an evidence box locked away until technology caught up with justice. When detectives finally confronted Mark Ellison in February 2024, he looked almost startled, like someone waking up from a long sleep into a nightmare he thought he'd outrun. He lived in a modest farmhouse outside of Wilmington, Vermont. 2 grown kids, divorced, quiet life. He was still doing light carpentry jobs, known around town as dependable, maybe a bit withdrawn. But when state police cruisers pulled into his gravel driveway that cold morning, the quiet ended. Inside his kitchen, investigators asked for a voluntary interview. Ellison agreed, perhaps thinking the matter was something else. Unpaid fines, old business paperwork. When the topic shifted to Rachel Pierce, his face changed. He leaned back, crossed his arms, said he barely remembered her. That was a long time ago, he muttered. But his eyes flicked toward the window, his jaw tightening with every question. Detectives told him they had new forensic results. He shook his head. "You're wasting your time." But when they mentioned DNA, his posture faltered. Within hours, he was under arrest for second-degree murder and kidnapping. News traveled fast through Vermont's small towns. For people who had lived with Rachel's mystery like a scar that never healed, the name Mark Ellison meant little at first. But to the older residents, the ones who remembered 2003 vividly, it hit hard. Ellison had been the quiet handyman who fixed shelves at the library, who sometimes stopped by the diner where Rachel had breakfast. He wasn't a drifter or a stranger from out of state. He'd been right there among them all along. Rachel's mother, Linda Pierce, was 67 now. She still lived in the same Springfield home, surrounded by her daughter's photographs, mountains, bridges, the quiet corners of Vermont life. When reporters asked how she felt hearing about the arrest, she said softly, "I prayed this day would come. I just didn't think I'd still be here to see it." For the detectives who had inherited the case, some too young to even remember the original investigation, it was a career-defining moment. Lieutenant Aaron Baines of the Vermont State Police Cold Case Unit described it as the most emotionally charged briefing I've ever delivered. He remembered unsealing those old brown evidence boxes, the smell of aged paper and storage dust. "We owed it to her," he said. "This case was built by people who never gave up, even when the world stopped paying attention. The DNA link was powerful, but prosecutors knew a conviction couldn't rest on genetics alone. They needed a story, the how and why. So they began reconstructing Ellison's life around 2003. Records showed he'd been working part-time. Maintenance contracts at several public buildings, including the Brattleboro Community Library, where Rachel worked evenings. Pay stubs placed him there in September and early October of that year. Through interviews, a timeline emerged. Ellison's marriage was reportedly strained around that time. He'd filed for bankruptcy in 2002, his business collapsing after an unpaid contract dispute. Friends said he'd been drinking heavily, irritable, not himself. One former co-worker recalled him making offhand remarks about a pretty librarian who was too friendly for her own good. At the time, no one thought much of it. When detectives confronted him with these details, Ellison denied everything. His attorney insisted the DNA transfer could have been innocent, from fixing her car or touching something in the library. But that argument unraveled quickly when investigators compared the samples. The genetic material wasn't from a shared surface. It came from deep within the car's steering wheel crevices, the kind of trace left by prolonged, forceful contact. Forensic analysts testified later that the chance of accidental transfer was virtually non-existent. Combined with the witness statement placing him near Rachel that evening, the evidence began to close in. Meanwhile, journalists revisited old archives. Local stations replayed footage from the early 2000s, candlelight vigils, police searching along Route 30. The town looked younger then, people holding posters under umbrellas, hoping against logic. Seeing it again stirred deep emotions across Vermont. Rachel's case had become a part of local folklore. Parents warning daughters not to drive alone at night, neighbors checking in on each other more often. Now, 2 decades later, the monster had a face. In March 2024, a grand jury formally indicted Mark Ellison on charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom in Windham County was packed for his arraignment. Reporters from Burlington, Boston, even New York came to cover it. Small-town Vermont hadn't seen a trial like this in years. Ellison appeared pale, his hair gone grey, his wrists cuffed loosely in front of him. When the judge read the charges, he didn't look up. His defense entered a plea of not guilty. Prosecutors outlined the narrative they intended to prove. Ellison, who had become infatuated with Rachel, confronted her outside the library on October 8, 2003. He offered to help with a car issue or asked for a ride, then forced his way in. The abduction was brief, violent, and unplanned. A burst of control gone too far. When he realized what he'd done, he hid her body off a wooded trail and fled. The case remained unsolved, only because the technology to expose him hadn't existed yet. But there were gaps. No one had seen the moment of abduction. No murder weapon was ever recovered. Defense attorneys seized on those uncertainties. They painted Ellison as a scapegoat, a man whose life was being destroyed by DNA, hysteria, and retrospective storytelling. They argued that contamination from shared public surfaces, even old evidence handling, errors, could explain the match. To the jury, though, the story of Rachel Pierce carried more weight than any legal argument. Over the weeks that followed, her friends and family took the stand. Her co-worker described the last night she saw Rachel alive, the quiet smile, the sound of keys jingling, the headlights disappearing down Main Street. Her father recounted the sleepless nights, the fruitless searches, the sound of his wife crying in the kitchen for years. Then came the science. Jurors were shown diagrams of DNA extraction methods, digital reconstructions of the genealogy network that had led investigators to Ellison. The lead forensic genealogist explained how thousands of data points across online ancestry databases had converged on one family line, Ellison's. The probability of random coincidence, she said, was less than 1 in a billion. The emotional climax came when detectives described unsealing the evidence after 2 decades. It felt like opening time itself, one said, like she'd been waiting for us. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd gathered every day, locals holding signs reading "Justice for Rachel." They stood through snow flurries and wind, like sentinels for a promise finally being kept. During cross-examination, Ellison showed flashes of irritation. When pressed about his whereabouts that night, his answers shifted. At first, he claimed he was home watching the Red Sox game. Later, he said he'd gone for a drive to clear his head. Investigators had already checked his phone, though primitive by 2003 standards, had last pinged within a mile of the library around 9 p.m. That timing lined up too neatly to ignore. In late July 2024, closing arguments began. The prosecutor stood before the jury and spoke simply. For 21 years, Rachel Pierce's voice was silent. Today, science speaks for her. When the jury returned after 3 days of deliberation, the courtroom was silent except for the rustle of paper. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Rachel's mother wept quietly, her hands pressed together in her lap. Her father stared straight ahead, a single tear tracing down his cheek. Outside, the church bells in Brattleboro rang. Not officially ordered, just spontaneously as word spread through the town. Mark Ellison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible emotion, only muttered once under his breath, It was an accident, though no one believed him. In the months that followed, the story became a case study in how modern DNA technology, especially forensic genealogy, could resurrect justice from forgotten evidence. Vermont State Police expanded their cold case unit, applying similar methods to other unsolved files. Rachel's name appeared on national true crime programs, her face now symbolizing not tragedy but perseverance, at a memorial held that autumn, the same town green, where candles once flickered 2 decades earlier filled again with light. Rachel's photograph stood at the front, surrounded by yellow leaves and framed by a sign reading, "She was found." Lieutenant Baines spoke briefly to the crowd. Rachel's case taught us something, that even when time tries to bury the truth, it leaves traces. You just have to look close enough. The wind carried softly through the trees, the same trees that had once hidden her. For the Pierce family, closure didn't mean peace, not entirely. But there was relief. Her mother said she could finally drive past Route 30 without pulling over to cry. Her father visited her grave every Sunday, leaving wildflowers and reading aloud from her favorite poems. And somewhere in a secured evidence vault, the old boxes from case file 032147 remain, not as relics of failure, but proof that justice, no matter how long delayed, can still find its way home. For nearly 2 decades, Rachel Pierce's case sat in a row of grey filing cabinets at the Vermont State Police Barracks in Rockingham, a heavy drawer labeled 2003, active, unsolved. Every few years, a new detective would inherit it, flip through the files and quietly return it to the shelf. Leads dried up. Witnesses moved away. Technology back then could only take them so far. In 2003, DNA profiling existed, yes, but it was still crude by today's standards. Partial profiles were common. Contamination risk was high. The evidence recovered from Rachel's car. Fingerprints smudged on the window, fibers from the seat, faint blood traces near the door handle, produced no clear matches in CODIS. Even the hair found under her fingernails yielded only a partial sequence, insufficient for identification. Detective Sergeant Jim Matthews, one of the original investigators, still remembered the early days. He'd been in his 30s then, newly promoted with a young daughter not much younger than Rachel. "We thought we'd have it solved by Christmas," he once said. "We had witnesses, we had evidence, we had motive theories, but nothing clicked." The case drained manpower and morale. In early tips trickled in, sightings that went nowhere, false confessions from drifters seeking attention, rumors about ex-boyfriends. Each one investigated, each one discarded. The local newspaper eventually stopped running updates. The world moved on, but the Pierces never did. For Linda Pierce, every holiday was a reminder of absence. She'd leave the porch light on year-round, a silent signal for a daughter who'd never come home. Rachel's old camera sat on a shelf by the kitchen window, lens cracked, dust gathering like time itself. By 2010, most of the original investigators had retired. A few new detectives reopened the case as part of a statewide review of unsolved homicides. One of them, a young forensic analyst named Emily Hart, noticed something odd buried in the evidence log. An entry labeled Sample Number 43A, Degraded Tissue Fragment, Unknown Origin. The note beside it read simply, Insufficient for DNA analysis. Hart requested the sample. At that time, improved PCR methods could amplify even minute fragments of degraded DNA. But the results were faint, incomplete. A few alleles here and there, not enough to generate a match. She uploaded the profile into the national database anyway. Nothing. Another dead end. For the next decade, Rachel's case flickered between active and dormant. Detectives revisited old witnesses, even consulted psychics. Desperate measures in a cold case world. One psychic claimed Rachel had been buried near running water. Investigators checked the riverbanks again, but nothing surfaced. Meanwhile, forensic science advanced quietly in the background. By 2018, genealogy-based DNA tracking was transforming cold cases nationwide. The Golden State Killer arrest that year sparked a wave of renewed hope for unsolved homicides. Vermont's small forensic lab began exploring partnerships with private databases like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, where people uploaded genetic data to trace ancestry, not realizing those same profiles could also identify murderers. Rachel's file caught the attention of a newly formed unit in Montpellier. The Cold Case Task Force, reactivated under Attorney General Lisa McCready, prioritized cases with preserved biological evidence. Rachel stood out. The DNA fragments, though partial, were well documented and properly stored. In 2021, the lab re-examined them using cutting-edge whole genome sequencing. This time they succeeded. The lab produced a low-level but readable sequence. Analysts compared it against a public genealogy database, identifying a cluster of relatives in upstate New York. The genetic trail pointed toward a single family line, the Ellisons. Investigators began building a family tree spanning 5 generations, cross-referencing public records, obituaries, and social media profiles. By early 2023, only one living male in the Ellison line fit the right age and geographic range. Mark Ellison, born 1974, residing less than 20 miles from the abduction site in 2003. Detectives began surveillance quietly. They collected discarded items, coffee cups, cigarette butts, from his trash. The Vermont Forensic Laboratory extracted DNA from one of those items and compared it to the 2003 crime scene sample. The match was near perfect, a probability ratio exceeding 1 in 1.2 billion. It was the break they'd been waiting for, 2 decades in the making. Before confronting Ellison, investigators spent weeks reconstructing the old evidence chain. They re-interviewed surviving witnesses. One elderly man, then 84, remembered seeing a light-colored pickup parked by the library that night. Old records confirmed Ellison owned a cream 1999 Ford Ranger back then, sold months later under a different name. Police traced it to a salvage yard in New Hampshire. Even though the vehicle had long been scrapped, its registration data placed Ellison in Brattleboro exactly when Rachel disappeared. They cross-referenced his employment records, the library maintenance job, the side work at a nearby church. Each detail closed the net tighter, but even as the case gained traction, the emotional toll resurfaced. Forensic analyst Emily Hart, now leading the team she'd once assisted, said, "Every time we reopened the box, we felt her presence. It was like she'd been waiting for us to learn how to listen." Inside those boxes, old photographs had faded. Images of search parties combing woods, police sketchboards filled with names and arrows. Seeing them again was like stepping back into the early 2000s, flip phones, grainy camcorder footage, handwritten logs on legal pads. It was a different world, but the grief felt timeless. Detectives reconstructed the original investigation from those records. What went wrong? What was missed? In hindsight, it was clear how proximity and familiarity shielded Ellison. He wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was the local handyman. He helped build shelves, fixed doors, even waved at officers during the search. No one looked at him twice. It wasn't just Rachel's case that haunted Vermont law enforcement. It was what it represented, how easily familiarity can hide danger. "We all thought we knew him," one officer later said. "That's what kept him safe for so long." When the DNA results came in, Hart called Lieutenant Baines late at night. "We have him.